Hello and welcome. We are going to get started. Thank you all for joining us today for our webinar, Best Practices for End-to-End Supply Chain Due Diligence in the EU. We are excited to present the topic of an end-to-end supply chain transparency program here today with Martello Risk. Whether you are knee-deep in your program or just getting started, you will find value in this webinar. Before we get started, we have some general housekeeping to go over. Slides will be emailed to registrants after we conclude, and also a recording of this presentation will be made available on our website, and both will be emailed to you once available. We will answer all questions via email shortly after the webinar concludes. So if you have any questions throughout the presentation, please enter them into the GoToWebinar control panel. Some brief introductions. This is Alexandria Bennett. I'm the Business Development Director here at Source Intelligence, and I will be speaking shortly after we hear from Caspar Fithen. Dr. Caspar Fithen is the founding director of Martello Risk. With over 20 years experience working on the political economy of extractive industries in conflict-affected areas, Dr. Fithen is an internationally acknowledged expert on the management of natural resources, particularly with the alluvial and artisanal mining sectors, and the establishment, management, and audit of such supply chains and chains of custody concerned with both minerals and timber. During the course of his career, Caspar has worked extensively with the United Nations Security Council as a member of numerous panels of experts, the European Commission as a special advisor on the Kimberley Process Certification Scheme, the Extractive Industries Transparency Initiative, the U.S. State Department, and the U.K. Department for International Development. He is an author of a significant corpus of work written for both academic and official audiences, and also holds a Ph.D. in the conflict economy of the West African diamond trade from University College London. We are very pleased to have Caspar on the webinar today and to be able to partner with Martello Risk to provide clients with comprehensive supply chain compliance solutions. A look at today's agenda. First, Caspar will delve into the changing regulatory environment in the European Union and what companies in the EU and operating in the EU should be aware of specific to responsible mineral trade. I will then walk you through what a supply chain risk mitigation strategy looks like. In order to have a world-class supply chain compliance program, you will need to understand where, what, and how risks lie in your supply chain. What are the types of risk and how to measure them and how to mitigate them. Caspar then walk you through the audit process of those risks. So let's hear it from Caspar.
Thank you very much, Alexandra, for your introduction. I will initially go through the legislation timeframe, but just to give listeners some background, the European Union has been aware now for some time that it would have to introduce some form of legislation with regard to supply chain due diligence in line with the guidelines that were issued by the OECD. So back in March 2014, there was an initial European Commission proposal to begin drafting legislation around these regulatory issues. That was followed by a mandate in May 2015, and in December 2015 there was another mandate by the Council of Ministers. This again was then followed in 2016 by the 5th Trilogue Agreement, and then was backed earlier last month by the European Parliament International Trade Committee, which voted 29 to 2 abstentions in favour of the general structure of the legislation, which is now effectively finalised bar a few minor addendi. And this will be sealed by the Strasbourg plenary in March and confirmed by the Council shortly afterwards. The Act itself, the legislation, will then be finally adopted in May of this year, but there's a lag time until the regulation will actually come into application, which will be in January 2021. To give you some idea of the main elements, the effective element of most importance, obviously, is the fact that the due diligence for European Union importers of 3TG minerals, that's tungsten, tin, and tantalum and gold, is going to be mandatory. And there had been some debate about that, in particular between the European Parliament and the European Council and the Commission. What will be different from the US legislation, which is currently in place under Dodd-Frank 1502, is that the scope will not be limited to the Great Lakes region of Central Africa. It will be global. So minerals coming from all over the world will be subject to the same level of due diligence, regardless of whether that's in the Congo or whether that's in Latin America or whether it's in Indonesia or whatever. The obligations will be consistent with the five-step framework of the OECD due diligence guidance, and there will be eventually an EU list of global responsible smelters and refiners. This will be reviewed every 2 years after the entering into the application of the regulation, and every 3 years thereafter. So the European Union recognition of supply chain due diligence industry schemes will be based on the existing OECD methodology. And for those of you who are not familiar with that, that can be found on the OECD website. And it's a specific set of criteria and methodologies. And what it effectively is a combination of voluntary supply chain due diligence procedures, tools and mechanisms, which specifically and importantly include third-party audits. These have been ongoing for the last 2 years now, particularly in Congo and Rwanda, where the audits have been undertaken as part of the regional certificate mechanism, which was brought into force by the regional organization, the International Conference on the Great Lakes region. And this organization is currently conducting third-party audits on specific mining areas, as I said, in Eastern Congo and Rwanda. On the technical and administrative side and the political side, the Council of Ministers will indeed take into account diverse industry practices covered by the schemes, and the recognition shall largely be based on the OECD methodology and criteria, as I've already discussed. And these schemes will be periodically reviewed by the Council of Ministers. There will be some additional European Commission commitments. They will bring in some external expertise for an indicative, non-exhaustive list of conflict-affected and high-risk areas. So, as I said earlier, that may not simply be confined to the Great Lakes region of Central Africa, but it could indeed include other areas on the globe. One might think of places like the border between perhaps West Papua and Papua New Guinea, areas within Latin America where there are the activities of non-state actors in mining areas and so forth. But that will become clear over time once that survey and assessment has been undertaken. The Commission will review the regulation and consider making additional legislative proposals as and when needed. And they will develop conflict minerals guidance for downstream companies to complement non-financial disclosure legislation and a transparency register. The development of a support system for a supply chain due diligence of small medium enterprises will also be undertaken. So in effect, the European partnership will be comprised of two principal elements, which is that the EU member states, the European Commission, businesses and NGOs will work together to support the socially responsible extraction of minerals, particularly in conflict zones and other high-risk areas. This will ultimately make a difference on the ground in vulnerable regions and in the supply chains connecting EU businesses and consumers. So at this point, I will hand over to Alexandria. Now, just in a brief summary of what we're discussing today, is that while we are focused in particular on the due diligence of the supply chains of minerals coming from conflict and high-risk areas, we, in partnership with Source, have put together an end-to-end structure which not only will can be applied to conflict minerals, but a number of other commodities traded around the world. We are currently recording more webinars. We will be looking at cobalt shortly. We'll be looking at colored gemstones. We'll be looking at palm oil, to name but a few. As I've already said, the system that we have designed over time will indeed be applicable to a number of different commodities, issues, the environment, toxic waste, and so forth. And at this point, I will now hand over to Alexandria, who will give a summary of the downstream capabilities of Source Intelligence before I finish off with our upstream capabilities at the other end of the smelters and the world that exists between there and the actual mines in the bush in Central Africa and elsewhere. Alexandria, over to you.
Well, great, Caspar. Thank you so much for that introduction on the EU regulations that are happening right now. I'm excited to be here on behalf of Source Intelligence to talk about a great topic today. A topic that I think will move companies into true supply chain transparency. Thank you, Caspar, for speaking and being here. We're always happy to have such great experts co-present with us on the topic of supply chain due diligence. I think the first step here is really to talk about risk. So, developing a sustainable program for identifying and mitigating supply chain risks. And ultimately, that will be how companies achieve supply chain transparency and affect ethical and social change within the supply chain. So today we're discussing end-to-end supply chain due diligence. But the key to developing a robust program is to first understand where risk lies in your supply chain. So I'll start us off with that, or I'll continue with that. I'll walk you through what the process looks like, what we think will give you the best practice for identifying that risk, and really how to partner with auditors so that you can have the most robust program and most cost-effective program for your needs.
So, if it's not obvious, an effective end-to-end supply chain compliance program starts with an effective strategy. I will share with you today best practices that come from Source Intelligence Supply Chain Compliance Program that was designed in partnership with our global enterprise clients over the past few years, which is based on proactive compliance strategy for substance-based product regulations and ethical sourcing standards. The goal of the process, and what should be the goal of any process you develop, is to have an active library of the substances in your products and their concentration levels that can be proactively compared to any number of current, changing, and emerging worldwide regulations or industry-imposed substance restrictions. The process of actively managing the substances in your products has proven to be advantageous for many companies. As you likely know, if you work in the world of compliance, you face on a consistent basis new product regulatory requirements, such as the new labeling requirements coming from California Prop 65, or the addition of phthalates for the EU ROS, or your company may just face new regulations altogether that you have to understand. Once you have defined and set your strategy as proactive, your supply chain compliance process starts by communicating your corporate policies to supply chain. If you do not have set policies, what standards are a part of your company's compliance and social responsibility program? There are multitudes of regulations and standards that are driving companies to engage their supply chain. So you'll need to identify those relevant to your company and distribute policies. You will then need to gather and vet data to map your supply chain. This one is a lot bigger category because there's a number of elements associated with just that small task. You will send out or should send out multiple forms of documents that may include your annual code of conduct policy, terms and conditions, and a host of other document types that will need to be signed and returned. In addition, you may have your own restricted substances list or policy and contract manufacturing agreements covering issues like chemical compliance and quality control documents that will need to be exchanged with your supply chain. Implementing comprehensive supply chain due diligence program will include data collection for chemical compliance, but also ethical sourcing initiatives. Human trafficking, anti-corruption, these are covered in terms of document management and analysis. So when you're working with so many forms of data, regulations, and standards, data collection can hinder companies from progressing in their supply chain compliance programs. Some best practices that we found from collecting documents from, over the 300,000 suppliers that are on our network, communicating in your supply chain's language. Our multilingual supplier engagement team greatly impacts our ability to make contact and collect necessary supply chain data. So absolutely communicate in your supply chain's language. Be able to engage with your suppliers during their working hours. We operate a 24/7, 7 days a week business operations center so that when questions come in, we can help guide or educate our network of suppliers. To the best of your ability, cover worldwide business hours so that you can provide that same response. When it's easy for all tiers of your supply chain to exchange information, you get the information you need. So make data collection and sharing easy for your suppliers. One way to ease the burden on your suppliers is to provide training and education on the regulations and standards a part of your company's supply chain compliance strategy. If a supplier has to learn about a regulation or a standard on their own, responses could be delayed or may never come at all. You will also want to keep an audit trail. And lastly, reduce supplier fatigue. Since Source Intelligence has a growing number of suppliers updating their profiles, responding to multiple client requests is very easy. However, it's understandable if you're not using a solution that has this capability, reducing, supplier fatigue could be a little more challenging. So after, you map your supply chain and obtain supply chain data, you will need to put it through a risk screening. In order for you to have a cost-effective supply chain compliance program, you'll need to strategically build deeper verification efforts into your process. We'll go into a little detail about that on the next slide. So even though there's a level of due diligence built into the data collection process that will likely satisfy many compliance requirements, we are actually finding that there's a need for deeper verification for certain suppliers and certain supplier data depending on the circumstances. So as a part of your corporate policy, you should determine the level of risk that is acceptable for each standard or regulation. Let's say you have a policy for human trafficking in your supply chain, or let's say your human trafficking policy is zero tolerance and one of your supplier sources from a high-risk country. You should rate that risk and track that level of risk. So we're going to cover this a little bit more on some of the types of risks that you may see on the next slide. So you're going to want to go through a risk screening and identify, here I have listed some of the things that may happen, but keep in mind these are just a few. Incomplete data, a substance on the banned substance list, sourcing country flag, level of chemical reported is higher than it's supposed to be, quality issues, missing information. Mitigating risk in your supply chain starts by getting this clear view. And the outcome of the risk analysis can take you in different directions. You should decide if suppliers flagged as high risk, move on to approval, or go back to a recurring risk screening, whether that be biannual or another desired frequency. That's all part of your strategy that you should set for each standard or regulation. You could also eliminate this step altogether and move suppliers forward to a secondary level, a formal risk assessment, if that's manageable. A formal risk assessment is another supplier information request. On-source intelligence that can be automated, once again built into your program. You will likely have different succession plans for different regulations and standards, like I just mentioned. So, keep in mind for standards that could be consumer facing, multiple levels of risk assessment are recommended, so supplier provided data does not put your brand reputation at risk. So as incoming responses are scored according to your risk weighting and scoring schema, you should determine if the supplier has adequate risk controls and decide if this rises to the level of an on-site audit, or if it would be, or if they would move back to a recurring risk screening, if that's sufficient. Implementing a risk screening process will enable your company to prioritize on-site audits with many times limited resources. So let me actually pass the mic back to Caspar from Martello Risk so he can walk you through how to move from a risk assessment to an audit, and I'll pick up when he finishes his presentation.
Thanks, Alexandria. I will take over here just to recap on the issues that I discussed earlier in the presentation. So we're working within a context of increasing global legislation. The legislation is in the US in the form of Dodd-Frank 1502. We've got forthcoming European Union legislation, and legislation is being introduced in China for manufacturers there as well. Now, with regard to end-to-end, we believe that end-to-end means from the place where a mineral is extracted from the ground to the point that it enters the manufacturing supply chain and travels down to the consumer. What we see is the problem with current legislation across the board, both in Europe and Dodd-Frank and in China, is that there is an issue with regard to the depth of the due diligence that is undertaken, and often it only runs as far upstream as the smelters. We are of the firm opinion, garnered through lots of experience in the region and with supply chains in the upstream, that most of the risk to companies in fact exists between the smelters and the mines. These are the bits that are deep in remote areas and are often outside the scrutiny of both the state and the state in these producing countries. The authority of the state in these producing countries is often limited outside the capital cities, and also the scrutiny of NGOs and the international community. So what we do is as Martello Risk, is provide independent third-party supply chain audits on this area. And we provide the clarity across upstream supply chains by conducting audits and investigations. We also audit mines in even the most remote areas, as well as the smelters, the brokers, the wholesalers, the exporters, ensuring that everybody conforms to the OECD standards. Now, just to give you an example of what that really means, when working for the International Conference on the Great Lakes region, for whom we are one of only 3 independent auditors accredited by them. For instance, we might be working in Rwanda, and in order to visit a mine in Rwanda, typically one hops into a 4-wheel drive in Kigali, the capital, and within an hour and a half, 2 hours, we're at the mine. We can conduct audits over a 2 to 3 day period, and then we're back to the capital, and the job is done. When we're operating in places like Eastern DRC, a typical audit could last for a month, simply because of the size of the country, the lack of infrastructure, and the difficulty of getting round. And that often means traveling for days, 8 hours a day often, on motorbikes along paths because there are no roads, crossing large rivers in boats and so forth. But we believe that this is the only way that we can actually get the level and depth of information with regard to the upstream for our clients. Now, the cross-sectional risks in the upstream supply chain include money laundering, terrorist financing, arms trade financing, conflict in the Middle East, conflict in Asia, the Latin American illicit drug trade, money laundering, violations of various sanctions, both United States sanctions, United Nations and European Union, environmental degradation, and of course human rights abuses, including forced resettlement and child labour. So what this represents to our clients is, and I should say, reiterate that this doesn't only apply to minerals, this applies to a number of other commodities as well, but it represents reputational risk, ethical commitment risk, legal risk, political, financial, and environmental risk. In other words, any company lacks control over its supply chain is operating in the dark unless it has full assurance of the security of its far upstream supply chain. And if a company is not monitoring this closely, you can be sure that others are, particularly if your company is a global brand. And the sort of people who will be monitoring the supply chain will be NGOs, civil society groups, law enforcement, sanctions regimes, and legislative framework monitors, both national, regional, and international. So going back to, as I said, with our unique approach really is about an on-the-ground proactive approach, which we base on local and global intelligence, geographical, historical, and political knowledge, on-the-ground investigation, analysis, assessment, and the years of experience that we've put together as members of the company and in other roles as well. So we have a truly global reach, and we produce reports on an annual basis on over 70 countries into a variety of industry sectors, from telecommunications to all aspects of the extractive natural resource sector. The core of our work is Africa and Latin America, but we're equally at home producing investigative and analytical reports on the banking sector in Vietnam, as we are mineral supply chains in the DRC. And we have an extensive network of associates, advisors, analysts, and political risk experts who provide us with the ability to operate on a global scale. I thank you very much, and at that point I will hand back to Alexandria, who will make some concluding remarks. Thank you, Alexandria. Over to you.
Well, thank you, Caspar. To finish off to complete the process and really this diagram here, there's a number of paths that your company could take in implementing a supply chain compliance due diligence program. And really, it's important to conclude that if an on-site audit reveals major issues, so if Martello Risk were to audit any of your supply chain, the supplier is sent through a corrective action process. And, corrective action plans, like all supplier documents in the process, should be collected and reviewed and managed on a platform that is easily accessible through multiple people in your organization, whether that's a cloud platform like Source Intelligence or your ERP system. Progressive reporting may be required depending on the severity of the corrective action needed and the expected time of remediation. But once major issues are resolved, a supplier can move forward to approval. So this is how you take information that you are receiving, that you're both collecting from your supply chain and auditing from your supply chain, so that you can manage internally the suppliers that are at your level of approval. You regularly monitor supplier performance according to certain KPIs established in the corrective action phase, and loop back to formal risk assessment. Maybe go back to a formal risk assessment phase should something need action. So it's not a true end-to-end compliance program until you are looping back all pieces of information and managing that information so that you can have a continuous flow and management of the risks in your supply chain, and hopefully know what they are and mitigate those risks so that they don't even exist. And so, we encourage all organizations we speak to implement, a similar process, but tailored obviously to the needs of your business, products, market, and industry. Source intelligence can help in many of these areas shown on the diagram. Martello Risk is, plays an integral role on the audit portion and many of the corrective action portions of this program. So from consulting to applicable regulations, policy, management processes and procedures to data collection to a full outsource engagement, there are a lot of options for companies wanting to implement a true end-to-end supply chain compliance due diligence program. So I thank you all for listening today, and I hope the information was valuable. Will help you in your efforts to implementing a program or continuing your program. Just a concluding word, we have a number of webinars coming up, as actually Caspar mentioned. We bring in subject matter experts and industry leaders consistently to speak on topics of supply chain compliance and CSR and sustainable supply chains. So we invite you to check out our webinars, follow our blog, and stay up to date on white papers that are published either by Source Intelligence or by partner organizations. There are a number of resources that you can find available at sourceintelligence.com, and we encourage you to do so. If you joined us late and didn't catch the beginning of this presentation, just a brief note, all of these slides will be provided to you via email, as well as a recording of this presentation will be made available once it is ready to go and is on our website. And this is all going to be sent to you via email. So don't feel like if you didn't take copious notes, you're going to be in the dark. But thank you all for joining us today. We hope you have a great day, and onward and upward.